Yeah, the famous quote that he used with his own generals when they were saying about how will history view us, and he says, who the hell remembers the Armenian? Yeah. So tell us about that quote.
Just before the onset of World War II, the invasion of Poland in September 1939, just before that, Hitler was meeting with his generals in August 1939. And he was giving his generals a free hand to rule Poland, to dominate Poland without any concern whatsoever for that population, to devastate the Polish population. And he said, who remembers the Armenians? In other words, you guys can go in there and simply devastate the population. We want to establish our control over that area. But the irony of that statement, who now remembers the Armenians, is that, of course, all his generals knew what he was talking about. In fact, they did remember the Armenians. The problem was they didn't care. They knew and didn't care. Or they knew and thought it was just fine what the Young Turk government had done.
But what is known about efforts to resist the genocide as it was happening inside Turkey?
There was a very substantial complicity of the Turkish population in the genocide of the Armenians. However, that by no means signifies that every Turk was involved in this atrocity. And we do have knowledge, we do have evidence about individual Turks who sought to protect Armenians, who warned them beforehand, or who hid them for a whole variety of motives. And it's very, very important that we remember those actions as well. Hannah Arendt, in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, writing about the Holocaust, wrote that even if it's only two people who resisted an event like the Holocaust, we have to remember that, because that gives us hope for the future. That tells us that not every regime will ever, that not any regime will ever be able to establish 100% control over its population. In the same way, even if it's just a handful of Muslims who protected their Armenian neighbors, it's incumbent upon us to remember that, because that gives us the basis to hope for a better world where people indeed can live together despite their differences. There were German officials and businessmen and missionaries all up and down the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire was an ally of Germany in World War I. So actually a lot of what we know about what happened comes from German sources. Now, there are also American consular reports and missionary reports that are very useful. But the Germans, because they were allies, also had access to privileged information. And you have a whole range of responses. And for those Germans, especially in the military, and especially foreign office officials, many of them were not, shall we say, not adverse to the removal of Armenians. They might not have liked some of the excesses, but they thought that the idea of an exclusive pan-Turkic empire populated only by Turks, they thought that was a good idea, and that Armenians were quote-unquote troublesome. Even though most of these German officials were Christian and Armenians were Christian, for many of these people in the military, in official circles, the effort to establish German influence in Anatolia and the Middle East was more important to them than the fate of Armenians. And that kind of callousness is something that we can see carried into political thinking and military thinking way beyond the Armenian genocide, but really on into the Second World War and the Holocaust. On the other hand, there were other individual Germans who wrote about, talked about, photographed the Armenian genocide because they were appalled by what they had seen. The German missionary Johannes Lepsius is a very important example, and he circulated his writings and his documentary collections in official circles in Germany in 1916-17, hoping that the German government would rein in its Ottoman ally, all to no avail. Another important figure is Armin Wegener, who photographed the events of the genocide, who saw the caravans of people in horrendous circumstances being forced through the desert. So part of our photographic record comes from his efforts, and he then later was also an opponent of the Nazis and was thrown into a concentration camp. So we have an individual who, in his own humanitarian convictions and commitments, responded to both atrocities, although he was a member of neither one of those communities.
Hmm.